All right, everyone, thank you for being here. We are moving along. I hope that when you stop and think about some of the issues that we are dealing with as a nation today, social issues, political issues, racial issues, cultural issues, I hope that you are beginning to understand that issues that we experience today do not simply develop on their own spontaneously, that where you are at any particular moment is often a sum total of a series of past events that lead you to where you are. I've often felt that when looking at yourself as an individual, that who you are today is the sum total of all the decisions that you have ever made, both good and bad, plus all of the experiences that have happened to you, both good and bad. So that if you take everything that's happened to you in your life, plus all the decisions that you've made, and you add that up, it equals who you are today at this moment. That's my sort of analysis of things. And I think the same thing applies to nations as well. That if you want to understand the United States of America today, to understand, who you are, you have to understand where you were. That's the way I see it. That's why I think studying history is important. And that's what I mean when I talk about thinking historically. What you will discover is that there are events that occurred before you were born, but that we can still be experiencing the impact and the result of those events. That's why I think studying history is important. And the 19th century is going to be a period of great growth and great change and great crisis. It will be all of those things. As I mentioned to you a few times already, American expansion to the West happened with astonishing speed. As I said earlier, when Thomas Jefferson became president in the year 1800, well, he won the 1800 election. The western boundary of the United States was basically the Mississippi River, and by 1850, California becomes a state. So that is a very rapid expansion. So what we have going on here are a few things simultaneously. One, we have physical territorial expansion as the nation moves westward until we basically reach the Pacific Ocean. As I've mentioned to you earlier, that expansion came at a high price in terms of the impact of this expansion on the Native American population who inhabited those lands, and that the impact of this expansion on indigenous people was certainly not something that would have been a consideration to people living in the 19th century. So we have physical territorial expansion. We'll be talking shortly about the Mexican-American War, which began in 1846, which also was a major event that led to American territorial expansion. So the country is physically getting bigger in the 19th century. Also during the 19th century, we see the real acceleration of what we call the Industrial Revolution. In the year 1800, we're talking about a world where if you want to sail on a boat or a ship, you better hope that you have the wind to provide, movement for you. you are going to be sailing on a sailing ship, basically. And if you are out at sea and there is no wind, you do not move. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, now we have steamships. Mechanical power is now a force, and it will be a force that will change the way we travel. It will change the way we communicate. It will change the way we make things and buy and sell things. So the Industrial Revolution basically is the beginning of, if you prefer, you could simply say the beginning of the machine age. And I have my own idea. In a way, I feel that the more technologically advanced we become, the more dependent we become on technology. So I also feel that every technological advance comes with you pay a price as a result of it. It's sort of like how many people don't even know how to cook anymore. And the reason they don't know how to cook is because they've never been required to know how to cook. Or people who don't know how to sew, or people who don't know how to, make a fire, or there are a variety of skills that, in the 19th century, people simply needed to have them in order to function. And today, I mean, if there's a power failure and we lose our electricity, it's like our whole world stops, when we can no longer access the internet or charge our phones or send text messages or things like that. But the ability to use mechanical power to travel, to transport goods and people, to make things is going to change the way not only the way that people live in the United States, but the way people live in the world, in many parts of the world. So that is happening in the 19th century. And something else that's happening with the United States in the 19th century is that the debate over the issue of slavery is going to accelerate and intensify. And ultimately, it will prove to be an issue that Americans will not be able to resolve peacefully. Sooner or later, we all pay a price for what we do, I think. And nations do too. And I think that the United States, being established as an independent nation that continued slavery, we were set on a collision course with ourselves, you might say, right from the beginning. When the United States became an independent nation, half the country is going to have slavery and half the country isn't. Abraham Lincoln, we haven't gotten to him yet, but Abraham Lincoln later is going to say that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And we were built from the beginning as a house divided against itself, because, as I said, how could this possibly work? I mean, think about it. How could it possibly work where half the country says slavery is okay and half the country says it isn't? How could that possibly work? And ultimately, it will lead to a civil war that will begin in the year 1861. It's extraordinary, really, that it didn't happen sooner. And there were moments where it certainly could have happened sooner. You're going to discover that history will teach you a lot about life and about people and about human nature. And one of the characteristics that I've learned as I've gotten older is that very often when faced with an unpleasant problem, it is much easier simply to ignore it and not deal with it. But that doesn't make it go away. If you have a problem, ignoring it may be convenient, but it doesn't fix it. And the slavery issue was something that people simply hoped they could avoid talking about. But as time goes on, it isn't going to work. The period after the War of 1812, pardon me, is known by this unusual name. People call it the era of good feeling. And the reason for that is that after the War of 1812, the United States experienced a brief few years in which there was not a major foreign or domestic crisis. Things were relatively stable. Now I'm talking about the period where we have the presidency of James Monroe. And I want to backtrack a little bit, because in my lecture on Jefferson, when I spoke about the War of 1812, I may have not mentioned that after James Madison, we ended up with James Monroe, who is most famous for something known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is something that I will require you to know. And the Monroe Doctrine basically is a statement of American foreign policy, where the United States basically says that the United States, will not tolerate any further European colonization or interference in the Western Hemisphere. It's a way of saying to the rest of the world, the Western Hemisphere is our neighborhood, and we really don't want you poking your nose around here. Now, we did not necessarily have the military capability or the power to enforce it, but it was a statement of policy where we're basically saying, you know, we are the main power in this part of the world, and hey, Europe, England, France, you know, Spain, we really don't want you to continue to poke your nose around in this part of the world. And as I said, we didn't have the military power to enforce that, but that was certainly an objective. And the Monroe Doctrine, of course, is named after President James Monroe. And James Monroe is sort of the last of these old school Revolutionary War era political leaders. And it isn't like everything was just perfect and peaceful entirely under James Monroe, but there were no major foreign or domestic crises. Although, if you scratch a little bit below the surface, things are starting to develop. So, you know, things were relatively stable, but it's clear trouble is coming. And that trouble is going to be the fact that we will no longer be able to ignore the slavery issue. And here is the fine point of it. The slavery issue and territorial expansion are going to be connected to each other. They will not be separated. And here's what I mean. Before the admission of Missouri as a state, there was a balance between, you had a certain number of slave states and a certain number of free states that were in balance. A couple things are happening. By the time we get into the 1820s, 1830s, there are growing numbers of people, mostly in the North, who are supporting the abolitionist movement and who are recognizing slavery for what it is and recognizing a need to do something about it. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that opposition to slavery generally is growing during this time. And it makes the slave-owning states nervous, because for them, their entire economy is dependent. Slavery is the foundation of the Southern economy. It is slave labor that works the cotton fields, the tobacco fields. Their economy is very dependent on slave labor. So as the voices of abolitionism begin to grow, the slave states begin to feel threatened. And what they want is is to make sure that slavery as an institution is protected. And the way to do that is to ensure that they maintain their power in the Congress. What they don't want is for the number of free states to outnumber them, which would then result in being outnumbered in terms of representation. What they don't want is a situation where they wake up one day and realize that the number of slave states are in the minority and slavery itself becomes threatened. And it may not be a very pleasant thing to say, but we're talking about people who want to protect their interests. And for the southern states, maintaining slavery in the first half of the 19th century is a vital interest for them. It's the foundation of their economy, and they don't want it threatened. So things are going to get ugly and divisive. There will be people who will try and keep the peace and see if we can do some sort of, political deal to try to make everybody happy. And in the end, it doesn't work. I mean, I would argue that when the United States became an independent nation, right from the beginning, we were headed for a civil war. Because how can you not have one when half the country says slavery is okay and half the country says it isn't? Sooner or later, there's going to be a clash where one side will dominate. And Abraham Lincoln, for whom I have enormous respect, I think he said it very eloquently when he said, a house divided itself cannot stand. But he also said, and he was right, he said, I do not expect this nation to remain permanently half slave and half free. At some point, it will become all one thing or all the other. And in the end, we fought a bloody, brutal civil war that left well over 600,000 Americans killed or wounded. And that was, it took a war to finally decide this issue. And I would make the argument that we are still dealing even today with the legacy of it. The great author, James Joyce, wrote, and I don't know if I'm speaking the words exactly as he wrote them, but history is the nightmare that I keep trying to wake up from, or history is the nightmare that I keep trying to awaken from. And I think what he meant by that was, whether you are a history student or not, whether you study history or not, whether you care about history or not, the lives that we live are very much impacted by history, whether we like it or not. I believe that, and that's one of the reasons why I try to teach history, because I'm always looking for the connection between past and present. And I'm always looking for a way of better understanding the world that I'm living in today by examining its connection to past events. I think that's very useful. That's my opinion. So let's talk a little bit more about 19th century America. Periods of great technological change are always very exciting and a little scary at the same time. And there are always positive aspects of technological change and negative ones too. There's a lot of talk in our time about the environmental consequences of a modern industrial economy. Issues regarding climate change, air and water pollution, and so on. People didn't worry about, smog prior to the Industrial Revolution. People didn't worry about, toxic chemicals being dumped into rivers and streams prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now, that doesn't mean water was safe to drink because it wasn't purified, and you could still get an infectious disease and die. But the point I'm making is that when you look at industrialization, you're going to see the development of factories and goods that are going to be machine made and improvements in transportation and all the rest. You're going to have engines that are mechanical power. Well, they need a fuel source. People will burn wood, and then they will burn coal, and then later they will burn, fossil fuels. And we can talk about, the environmental consequences of that. But I feel like every technological advance comes with a price that you pay. Social media, for example, is something that did not exist when I was a child, that exists now. And although it can be very convenient in many ways, I also feel that it can be very harmful in many ways, psychologically and culturally for people. It reinforces what we want to believe and excludes that which we choose not to. So it's not always the best thing. I think that there's a price to pay for everything we get. And the price that America paid in the 19th century is we are going to have conflict with American Indians who will not be pleased to see Americans expanding into their territory as we continue our movement to the West. We are going to have war with Mexico. There will be growing and increasingly bitter debates in this country about the role of slavery, because the question is going to be, every time we add another state, should that state be a free state or a slave state? People who are dedicated to the abolitionist movement, they certainly do not want to see slavery expand. So they're going to want to see additional states brought into the Union as free states. But the southern states, fearing a loss of their own influence, are going to want to see additional slave states brought into the Union. So this conflict is set up, and it is a conflict that will be played out over and over. Every time a free state gets added to the Union, the southern slave states are going to be very angry about it. And every time a slave state is added to the Union, the people in the North largely, and those in particular who are in the abolitionist movement, are going to be very angry about it. So we're in a situation where no matter how something plays out, somebody is going to be angry about it. And in a way, I sort of feel a similarity with our own time. I feel like every time there is a social or political issue that is debated in this country, that no matter what the outcome is going to be or whatever the decision will be, half the country is going to be angry about it. So we are in a period in the United States in the 19th century where it is going to become increasingly difficult to find common ground. There will be people, both North and South, who will have common ground in the sense that they want to see things cool off. They want to try to maintain the status quo. They want to see if they can find political solutions to these problems. But in the end, they won't be able to do it. They're going to try. I would argue that they succeeded only in postponing the inevitable. I will be speaking to you in the coming weeks about a very interesting historical figure, a man named Henry Clay from Kentucky. Henry Clay was a member of Congress. He was a very intelligent man. He served in the House of Representatives. He served in the John Quincy Adams administration, which we'll talk about later. A long and distinguished career. He was known as someone who was good at giving speeches and making political deals. And he is going to spend a great deal of his political career trying to keep the lid from blowing off this powder keg that is being developed. Because as I said earlier, and I know I'm being repetitive, but there's no fixing this. I mean, I'm not, I don't think I'm smarter than other people. I think there are people out there who are a lot more intelligent than I am. But I mean, if you look at this, I mean, I don't know how we could not have ended up in a civil war when we established ourselves as a country where half the country says slavery is okay and half the country isn't. I mean, these are not positions that can be reconciled. You can't. Um, People tried. Henry Clay tried. Henry Clay thought, well, you know, maybe if we can find a way to give everybody something that they want, we can get people to cool off. But in the end, what you ended up with is simply a postponement of the inevitable, because it doesn't fix the problem. The problem is half the country is slave, half the country is free. And no matter what political deal you make to try to get people to calm down at the moment, it doesn't change that. It doesn't change that, which is ultimately why we ended up with a civil war. So I hope you understand, you know, what I'm trying to say so far. There were a lot of factors that contributed to American growth in the 19th century. A high birth rate is one. Immigration is another. I mean, and it's interesting to me when I think about issues that we debate today. Certainly, the topic of immigration is a very, um, in some ways, a very divisive subject. I think Americans need to understand that, with the exception of indigenous people, with the exception of, you know, the American Indians, that, you know, everyone living in the United States today is either an immigrant from another part of the world or a descendant of people who came from another part of the world. And as I said earlier, there are two types of people who came to the United States: people who came here willingly and people who were brought here against their will, meaning slavery. But immigration has been a theme of American growth and development throughout its history, even going back, you know, to the colonial period. So we have in the 19th century people who are born and raised in the United States, already established generations. We have a relatively high birth rate. We have ongoing immigration to the country. And we have a technological revolution happening, and the industrial revolution is happening. So it's a very exciting time, and it's a time where there's a lot of opportunity. And certainly a lot of people are looking for their chance to make some money, acquire some land. And so we have a growing population, a rapidly industrializing economy, and an expansion to the West happening all at the same time. And on top of that, an increasingly bitter political division happening in the country over the slavery issue. So these are the topics that characterize the United States in the first half of the 19th century. So you'll discover when you look at the past that people are not as different as you might think. How they live may be different, but what they want is really never different. I mean, what do you want? What do you want in life? You want to have a stable job? You want to live in a clean, decent home? You want to have money? You want to be rich? You want to have a family? You want your family to be successful? What do you think people in the 19th century didn't want that? The way they may go about getting it may be different based on what the opportunities were and what the technology was, but people want what they want. I don't think it makes much difference whether you're talking 1800 or 1850 or 1950 or 2021. The difference is in what's available. and how we go about getting what we want. But human nature, I don't think that people back then were necessarily all that different from people today. Different culture, different technology, but human beings are still motivated by the same needs and wants and desires. People wanted goods, they wanted to make money. And as the population grows, the demand for goods increases, which makes sense. I would like to take a moment and speak to you about someone who, in many ways, is sort of, the Steve Jobs of the 19th century. A man who had a vision for innovation that did change the world. Although the impact of this change was not all good, but it's still important to know. And that man is Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney is a critical person to understand during the Industrial Revolution because of some of not only the technology that he developed, but the concepts too. For example, when we reach a point where goods are being manufactured by machine, and the machines themselves are being built, Eli Whitney comes up with the idea where he says, I'll use firearms as an example, guns. If I'm a gun manufacturer, instead of making 10 or 20 or 50 guns, what if I make 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 and I make them all the same? So what that means is my production cost goes down. And it also means that if a repair is needed or a part needs to be replaced, if I have 1,000 of the same product in front of me, all the parts are interchangeable. That is a huge advance. Let's say, for example, that I am operating a textile mill to transform cotton fiber into cloth. And I have mechanical looms in operation in my factory. If one of them breaks and I have to call someone in to fix it, and they have to make replacement parts for it, they say time is money. If I have a machine that goes down, I want that machine up and running and back in operation basically immediately. Well, how nice is it to be able to simply remove a defective part and replace it with one that is ready-made that will fit? Imagine, for example, if you have a car and you need to replace the brakes. So you go to your mechanic, and your mechanic says, well, you better leave the car here for a few months because all the brake components have to be custom made, and that takes time. Not only does it take time, it's very expensive. But you don't have to do that. So for example, Devin, if you drive a Honda Civic and, Sarah drives a Honda Civic and the car is, they're the same model year, you drive, I don't know, a 2017 Honda Civic. You can go to an auto parts store and say, I have a 2017 Honda Civic, I need brake pads, and they'll give them to you in a box. And you take the old ones off, put the new ones on, they're going to fit. Sarah, you can do the same thing. You could take technically parts from your car and they'll fit someone else's. So the idea of interchangeable parts not only lowers cost, but it increases speed. So for example, if I have 150 mechanical looms operating in my textile factory, and some of the machines break down, the idea that I can simply remove the damaged parts and replace them with other parts, then they all fit each other, is what you want. So Eli Whitney he is the guy who deserves the credit. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. It seems like, well, of course, common sense, right? But before the Industrial Revolution, nothing is really machine made. Everything's handmade. Clothing. I mean, just imagine how much it would cost if every piece of clothing that you wear had to be handmade by a tailor or a dressmaker. Now, you can still get custom made clothing, by the way, if you want it. I mean, it's very expensive. You can go to a specialty store and you can have someone measure you up and say, I want to have, a dozen shirts, and you can pick the material that you want and have shirts custom made, and they're beautiful if you don't mind paying, $500 a piece, because it takes time. It's a skilled craft. One thing that I would like to do if I ever become very wealthy, I was reading about places that do custom clothing, and I was reading an article about a shoemaker in London, and you go there and you stick your feet in plaster of Paris. They make a mold of your feet, and then they have that on file. So if you ever need a pair of shoes, they make the shoes for you based on custom for yourself, and of course they're going to fit perfectly, and that's great if you don't mind paying between $2,000 and $3,000 for a pair of shoes or more. Look, nice things cost money. They always have, which is why in the 19th century the only people who had a large wardrobe were the wealthy. Ordinary people, I mean, let's put it this way: if you're a working class person or a poor person, you better believe you're going to know how to mend your socks. And you better believe that you are going to be wearing shirts and pants and clothing that belonged to your older siblings. And you will wear these items and use these items and patch and repair these items until there is nothing left to patch or repair. Because unless you have money, that's how it is. I mean, an ordinary person might have 2 or 3 shirts. A woman might have, 2 or 3 dresses. The only people who have a lot of clothing are the wealthy, because clothing is basically, the material itself has to be hand spun, and the clothing itself has to be handmade. Everything's done by hand, and it's great in terms of the quality of the product when it's new, but the time and the expense is extreme. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, you now have textile mills that can take cotton and turn that cotton into cloth in a fraction of the time. That lowers the cost. Now you have, cotton fiber has to be turned in from cotton fiber to thread, from thread to cloth, from cloth to clothing. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, you can do it in a fraction of the time. Lowers cost. And then you can end up with machine-made clothing. All of it lowers the cost. The flip side of that is it also means that the demand for cotton is going to go up. Because if I'm a southern plantation owner, cotton can now be processed much faster than ever. So I want to grow more and more and more. Well, who is doing the work to make that happen? Slaves. So the Industrial Revolution, in a way, is going to bind the southern states more to slavery and not less. So that's something you have to bear in mind. Eli Whitney is also known for an invention known as the cotton gin. Cotton fiber is an organic fiber. It comes from a plant, and slaves take care of the cotton plants. They harvest the cotton when it's ready. But in each piece of raw cotton that is harvested, you have these small seeds inside. Well, the seeds have to be removed before you can do anything with it. Well, that takes time. Every little piece of cotton you pick in the South on the plantations, you have slaves who are not only picking the cotton, but then they take every little piece of it and they have to kind of go inside and pull out these little seeds before the cotton is ready for processing. Now, Eli Whitney has a machine that does it. It's called the cotton gin. And you dump the raw cotton into one end of the machine and it comes out the other end of the machine with the seeds removed, ready to go. So again, one of the side effects of that is now you have a greater demand for cotton. You can now process more of it. And although the cotton gin will take the seeds out, you still need slaves to plant the cotton plants, take care of the plants, and pick the cotton. So what it does is it increases the demand for slaves, and it binds the South more tightly to this cash crop economy. I have a student in the chat. There's a famous handmade shoe store in LA. The shoes are made in front of you and made from Italian leather. Sounds great. Just make sure you bring your Visa Platinum card with you when you go there, because they probably cost $2,000 a pair or more, I would guess. But in the meantime, I'll have to stick with, shall we say, a less expensive product. Although if I ever did become someone of great wealth, I do like the concept of custom-made shoes. But I'm not going to spend, that kind of money on shoes. I'd like to, but not going to do it. Food, that's another matter. All right, just kidding. Let's move along. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, the American South is producing more than half of all the cotton in the world. It is generally estimated that they are producing basically 60% or more of all the cotton in the world is produced in the American South. So they're dependent on this. This is their livelihood, speaking of the plantation owners. You really don't have much of what we would call a middle class in the South. There really isn't a diverse economy. Everything revolves around, when they say in the South that cotton is king, they're not joking. And slavery and slave labor is the foundation for this whole system. But I don't want to let the people living in the North off the hook either, because, they're buying the stuff. You have to remember that, you have a lot of the textile mills are built in the North, which is where the Industrial Revolution really begins. States like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. But the fact that the cotton is being, picked by slaves doesn't stop any of the people operating the textile mills and making the clothing from buying the stuff. So, and that's one of the things that increases the demand for the cotton in the first place. So Eli Whitney and the cotton gin and the Industrial Revolution is going to make the South more dependent on slave labor as the demand for cotton rises. So be aware of that. We are not at a point yet where there is going to be, we're not going to have automobiles and, airplanes and freeways. And the cheapest way to transport goods is still going to be over water, and it still is. So this is where I want to speak to you now about what is, in my opinion, arguably the greatest engineering feat of the 19th century, at least in the United States, and that would be the construction of the Erie Canal. So you have in North America, there are the Great Lakes. And then, of course, running through the state of New York, you have the Hudson River. And the Hudson River empties out into what is now New York City and the Atlantic Ocean. So in New York, there was this very visionary governor by the name of DeWitt Clinton. And he had an idea. And his idea was, what if we can find a way to connect the Hudson River to the Great Lakes? Because if we do that, you can now open up the entire Northeast and, in a way, the entire Great Lakes region. You can open it up for trade and commerce and travel to the world. So what that basically means is, if you can build a canal that connects the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, you can now connect that entire region of the country to New York City, to the Atlantic Ocean. It means that, theoretically, you could be a furniture maker living, in Ohio or Michigan or Illinois, and sell your products in New York City, or frankly, have them exported all over the world. So he wants to build this canal, which is going to be, in the end, I don't know, was it 363 miles long? The technology to build it with mechanical power wasn't there yet. So you're talking about work that is being done largely by hand, with physical labor, and areas that require the removal of rock, for example, are going to have to be done with explosive, dynamite, nitroglycerine. Very dangerous, obviously. Let's just say that the safety protocols in place in the 19th century are not exactly things that would work today. So he has this idea to build basically a man-made river to connect the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, and then, of course, to New York City and to the world. A lot of people thought he was crazy. A lot of people thought it couldn't be done. But the man was a visionary, and he maintained his belief that this was possible. And it moved forward. A lot of people laughed at him. They referred to Governor DeWitt Clinton's canal. They called it Clinton's Big Ditch, because they thought it would never work. But it did work. And it was an instant success, because an entire region of the continent, which had been inaccessible, was now very accessible. And anyone who lived anywhere near the canal now has access. It creates a trade, transportation, travel, and communication network. It really did transform the country. And it turned the state of New York into an economic powerhouse. By the time of the American Civil War, the state of New York alone produces more manufactured goods than all the southern states combined. So this was a big, big deal. So before I continue, I have two video clips I want to share with you. One is about Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, and the other is about the Erie Canal. So bear with me here as I try and use my screen sharing feature.
Eli Whitney radically changed both agriculture and manufacturing in America during the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Eli Whitney is best known for his invention of the cotton gin, which revolutionized the cotton industry in the South.
He's also famous for the idea of interchangeable parts, which really helped initiate factory production and the second wave of industrialization.
Born in 1765, Eli Whitney grew up on a farm in Westborough, Massachusetts. After attending Yale, he got a job working on a tobacco plantation in South Carolina. With the tobacco market in decline, Whitney's employers turned to a new cash crop, cotton.
In that area, they had an abundant supply of cotton. However, the cotton has lots of seeds, and it took hours of manual labor to remove those seeds and then spin the cotton into a fabric.
Eli Whitney was a gadgeteer and what we would call an inventor today. He realized that this was a very laborious process and developed a simple machine, the cotton engine or cotton gin, to separate the cotton from the cotton bolls.
The cotton gin was a simple machine which was able to mechanically separate the fibers from the seeds 10 times more efficiently than a slave. It wouldn't have been possible to establish the cotton industry in the South without this device.
Its more efficient production of cotton called for greater demand for hands to produce the cotton and to harvest the cotton. The cotton gin led inadvertently and quite tragically to the explosion of the slave system, which had been on the wane in the late 18th century.
Whitney patented the cotton gin in 1794, hoping to install the device in cotton plantations all over the South, and charging farmers 2/5 of the cotton profits.
Because Eli Whitney's cotton gin was very simple, people then tried to infringe on his patents and they developed their own versions of it. So Eli Whitney spent a large fraction of his life suing people who were trying to infringe on his patents.
Since Whitney had such a hard time receiving profits from his cotton gin, he went into the arms business, and in 1798 won a congressional contract to build 10,000 muskets for the U.S. Army.
In Eli Whitney's time, every item had to be made from scratch and its parts were self-contained.
Building 10,000 muskets as individuals would take an enormous amount of time. That's where he conceived the idea of interchangeable parts. So you can make 10,000 triggers, 10,000 barrels, 10,000 rifle butts, and then put them together as needed.
This introduced the concept of assembly and revolutionized mass production.
Late in life, Whitney wed Henrietta Edwards, and together they had several children. 8 short years later, Eli Whitney died on January 8, 1825. Today, Eli Whitney is often considered the father of American technology.
Eli Whitney has an important legacy as symbolizing the constant innovative tendency of the Industrial Revolution.
While most people remember him for the invention of cotton gin, it's really the concept of assembly in interchangeable parts that truly changed the world.
Okay, so you need to know about Eli Whitney, and you need to know about. Hold on a moment. So you need to know about Eli Whitney and about the cotton gin and about interchangeable parts. But you have to bear in mind, as I said earlier, and that the video mentioned also, that by creating a machine that allows for cotton to be processed more quickly, it also is going to result in an increased demand and dependency on slave labor. They are not separated. So slavery is going to become a critical part in the American economy during that period. And then, of course, it's going to also become an issue when we talk about American Western expansion. And I'm going to focus more on the Compromise of 1820, known as the Missouri Compromise, in my next lecture. But I do want to take a moment and and show you a video clip about the Erie Canal, and then we'll call it a day. But this I want you to see. Hold on a moment.
Even though the Erie Canal quite literally helped shape this nation, this is what so many people think of first when the canal comes up in conversation.
I've got an old mule and her name is Sal. 15 years on the Erie Canal.
But except for the fact that mules did indeed drag boats along the Erie Canal, from Albany
to Buffalo.
Even singer and historian Dave Ruck will tell you the song actually has very little to do with it.
Is there any evidence that it was ever actually sung on the Erie Canal, except for situations like this.
Turns out it's a 20th century song. It's actually written by a professional songwriter who was from, of all places, Massachusetts. So this man, Thomas S. Allen, he comes to Rochester, New York around 1910, sees the canal for the first time, hears the phrase low bridge, everybody down, low. And he ends up composing the song. It's the only canal song he wrote.
So he wasn't a canalman?
Not only was he not a canalman, but no one ever sang the song on at least on the 19th century canal.
The canal, which turned 200 years old last Tuesday, was championed by a man who was as stubborn as a mule. DeWitt Clinton, mayor of New York City, who became governor of the state. He spent 10 years fighting to sell this project to a deeply skeptical public.
It was hard. It was not an easy sell. These landowners that are listed.
Brad Utter is an historian at the New York State Museum. Presidents Jefferson and Madison refused to help fund the canal, so Clinton had to raise the $7 million needed to build it. Some people thought it was a great idea, but
not with my money. You're a little crazy because you're trying to go through swamps and virgin forest, and there's no labor, there's no machinery to do that kind of thing. This is all new.
It was a gargantuan undertaking for a nation just 41 years old. The canal would be dug by hand, every inch of it, for 363 miles. It would be 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. 83 locks would have to be built. But Clinton kept at it, financed the project with some state money and by selling bonds, and construction began July 4th, 1817. It was completed in just 8 years.
On time, in advance, and under budget.
Really?
Yes.
If only.
Yeah.
If only we could do that.
It's many miles to Buffalo, oh, that low bridge.
A trip that could have taken 6 weeks before the canal now took less than 1 week and cost 1/10 of an overland trip. So as soon as it opened, the canal was overwhelmed with traffic, and it paid for itself with tolls in just 10 years.
Over 100 years old.
John McKee operates the locks in Lockport, New York.
Sometimes there was a day or two wait just to get through the locks. Boats would be packed up on both sides of the banks right here. And of course, while they were lined up waiting to go through, they would spend their time and money in town here, and that added to the population here in Lockport.
Population grew in towns all along the canal. Rochester, New York Mayor Lovely Warren traces the beginnings of her city to the canal.
The Erie Canal was the foundation of Rochester. It was the foundation of our industry, and we were a flour mill city, and that's the way that Rochester first started to build itself up. Population started to grow once the Erie Canal came into fruition.
But the canal also accelerated the western expansion of the nation. People and commerce were able to reach and develop what would become the American Midwest. A region that was isolated and landlocked was now connected via the canal and the Hudson River down to New York City and the world.
Within a year or two, there were already calls of, hey, let's make it bigger.
And they did. By 1862, the canal was almost twice as wide and twice as deep. People and goods and ideas flowed 24 hours a day in both directions.
The impact that the internet has had on our culture and our society is very similar to the impact that the canal had. Sharing ideas, making things faster.
The canal was used to bring slaves to freedom. And
Part of the Underground Railroad.
Part of the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass would bring slaves here and actually lead them to freedom.
The first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, a canal town. And Joseph Smith started the Mormon religion in Palmyra, along the shores of the canal. But the progress and prosperity was not shared by all. The canal was dug right through traditional Native American land, displacing many who lived there to make way for the commerce that grew steadily for decades until the next great advance, railroads.
The Iron Horse was there. The railroad was there to compete. And the canal was more efficient. You could pull more with less energy and it's cheaper, but the railroad was fast.
The railroad took passenger traffic first, leaving the canal boats to haul mostly freight. But by the 1950s, most of the freight traffic was gone too.
Let the boats pass the next one.
Today, most of the boats John McKee puts through the locks are pleasure craft. The gates are opened by motors that are a century old. McKee and most everyone who works on the canal system feels the history of what in its early days was derided as Clinton's Ditch. Josh Pagan keeps digging today to keep the canal deep enough.
I realized that I worked at a museum that stretched from the Hudson River to the Niagara River in Buffalo and connected us to Lake Ontario.
The value of the canal cannot be measured anymore in tons of freight or numbers of passengers that it moves. But it is hard not to be moved by the canal itself and the achievement 2 centuries ago of just getting it dug.
What it represents, I think, is American ingenuity and American spirit. And so the fact that we still have this canal here today, I think it should be celebrated as long as we can keep it here.
Hold on just a moment. Okay, so that's basically my lecture for today. I will cover in some detail the Missouri Compromise of 1820 in my next lecture. And as I said, I have posted a quiz. It will be released on Saturday, and you will have the weekend to do it. It should not be a problem. And that's about it. So I will end my lecture for today, and anyone who has any questions or comments is free to remain.